Hi, I'm Doug Cha, Executive Director of the Governance Center here at the Conference Board. Welcome to today's book discussion webcast. Today we're really lucky to be joined by Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Joanne Lublin, Managing News Editor at the Wall Street Journal. Today we'll be talking about Joanne's book, Earning It, Hard-Won Lessons from Trailblazing Women at the Top of the Business World. Before we get started, I just have some housekeeping notes to cover. We're offering CPE credit for participating in today's live program. To get these credits, you need to stay online for the entire webcast. Enter your full name, email address, and specify CPE in the Request CPE credit space at the bottom of your screen. And 3 pop-up messages will occur during the program to confirm your participation, and click OK each time you see one. We welcome audience participation in today's webcast. If you type in your questions in the chat box, we will see them and work them into the discussion. You can enlarge your screen enlarge the window for full screen viewing by clicking the 4 arrows in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Please do complete the evaluation of today's program at the end so we can incorporate your feedback into future webcasts and get your suggestions. And this webcast will be recorded and posted for replay by you and your colleagues. And so now let's get started. Just introduction, Joanne has been a trailblazer in her career, one of the first female reporters at the Wall Street Journal. As she rose through the ranks, she served as a reporter in San Francisco, Chicago, Washington, D.C., was the deputy bureau chief of the journal's London bureau, returned to New York, and ultimately became the journal's management news editor. In 2003, she won the Pulitzer Prize for her stories on corporate scandals, which we'll get into in terms of corporate governance. And so those of us in corporate governance have seen her numerous articles in the journal over the years covering corporate scandals, governance issues, and career advice. And she frequently appears on television and at conferences to discuss executive pay and corporate governance. She published Earning It, Hard-Won Lessons from Trailblazing Women at the Top of the Business World in 2016. And the book talks, goes through tales of over 50 top female executives in the U.S. To hear about the successes and setbacks they've faced as women climbing the corporate ladder. So, Joanne, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and honor to have you here today. Let's just talk a little bit about the book itself in terms of how it came to being. Just want to get from you what inspired you to write this book, and what were some of your goals when writing?
Well, my main goal in writing the book was writing a book, because I've never written a book before. But as someone who had started the journal's first career column, I still do a career advice column called Your Executive Career, and as someone who's been writing about management issues, in particular corporate governance, for many, many years, I had met a number of women in the course of doing both of these pursuits who impressed me, but who made me wonder whether they had dealt with setbacks related to their gender early in their career, as I had as a journalist when I joined the Wall Street Journal in the 1970s. And so I ended up wanting to do a book about how these women had become better leaders by overcoming initially what I wanted to focus on, obstacles related to their gender. But as I began reporting the book, I was lucky enough to discover that nearly two-thirds of those 52 women I interviewed are experienced public company CEOs, and that all of these women had dealt with setbacks that had to do with their careers and not always related to their gender. But what becomes then the underlying theme of the book, and why then it becomes a leadership book that appeals to men and women alike, is how do you deal with setbacks, personal and professional, and become a better leader as a result. The other thing is, I have to correct you on one thing about my bio.
Okay.
I wrote one of many stories that were therefore qualified for the Pulitzer. They
Okay.
all had to do with the corporate scandals. In
Got it.
fact, we were all celebrating scandals like WorldCom. The story I wrote was a story about CEOs who had borrowed money in order to buy stock and ended up with margin calls that they couldn't repay, and in most cases got fired. But there were numerous other stories that were part of our coverage of corporate scandals.
Well, some didn't get fired. I recall a company offering to buy some painting collection or something like that to
Yes.
help the guy pay for it. Amazing. So, when you were writing this book, obviously it takes twists and turns, and you learn new things as you're interviewing people. What was the thing that most surprised you as you were in the process of writing?
Well, there were several things that surprised me, but I think at the end of the day, what most surprised me was that so many of these women I was meeting for the book are tall. And so after a while, I started asking every woman I was interviewing in the book, how tall are you? And some of them, like Carol Bard, said, before or after I started shrinking? And I said, before. And I discovered that more than a dozen of the women that I spoke to for the book, in their stocking feet stood 5'7" or taller. One was 6 feet. And what was equally surprising to me is however tall they were, but especially the ones who were very tall, they still wore very high heels. And I asked one such woman executive who was, and still is, 5'7", why she had to wear 3-inch heels. And she said, I was the first woman on the senior management team of the company where I was working, and I had to be able to deal with men, and I wanted them to deal with me as their peer and their equal. And the only way I could look most of them in the eye was wearing 3-inch heels. On the other hand, one of the women I interviewed, Nancy McKinstry, who is CEO of a Dutch company, although American, stands 5'2" in her stocking feet. And I pointed this out to her. Many of the women I've interviewed are much taller than you. How do you get taken seriously, not only as a female CEO, but as a female CEO who's only 5'2"? And she said, I think of myself as taller.
So a lot of it's just about attitude. Got it. So, in the course of your interviews, many prominent CEOs, you mentioned Carol Bartz, Mary Barra of GM, Ginny Rometty at IBM, Denise Morrison at Campbell's Soup. Of all these folks, maybe pick one out that was, surprising or particularly inspiring to you to talk about.
I think the woman I was most inspired by is Diane Bryant, who until recently was the highest ranking female executive at Intel. This is a woman who grew up in a family of an abused mother. Her father was a convicted criminal. He had spent time in prison before she was born, and her mother was an at-home mom. And Diane had a sister, and several times during her childhood, her mother tried to leave this abusive relationship. And each time they would have to go back because the mother had no source of income of her own. And Diane vowed at a very young age that when I grow up, I promised myself I would be financially independent and not reliant on any other human being for my support, because I don't want this to happen to me. Of course, what she didn't realize, or she forgot because her sister was older, is that her father had a very strict rule, which was he was willing to support his daughters until they turned 18. And on the day she turned 18, she came home from her senior year of high school in the little Volkswagen Beetle she had bought with her own money, to discover her mother sobbing on the front porch and her father standing on the lawn with all of her worldly goods surrounding him. And he said, this is your 18th birthday. I'm no longer supporting you. You can take whatever you can pack in your little car there, but the rest of it is mine. Well, of course, that meant she had to leave the 10-speed bike behind. And so she basically was homeless at the age of 18 and spent the next couple of months going from friend to friend's house, sleeping wherever she could until she could get her own apartment. She then got 2 jobs as a waitress and a server to put herself through junior college. And in her math class met a boy who told her that if she really wanted to make a lot of money, and in his mind that would have been $30,000 a year, she should become an engineer. And so she declared her major as engineering. And when she goes to the career services office with dollar signs in her eyes, the career guidance counselor who's going to coach her about going to four-year school says, well, do you want to be a software or a hardware engineer? She's so naive, she doesn't know the difference. But in her mind, software sounds somewhat more feminine. So she says, I'll be a software engineer. She gets out of college and she's hired by Intel as a $30,000 a year engineer.
Incredible.
Yeah,
Wow.
pretty incredible.
Well, I mean, it's amazing that you're able to get people to open up like that and be so forthcoming about their personal lives.
Because most of the interviews I did for the book were in person, but her travel schedule was such that when I came out to California to report the book, she was not there. So this was a phone interview.
Wow.
And I was just shocked.
Wow, pretty intense. Well, let's kind of turn to more in terms of just practical business issues. U.S. companies have made very little progress in closing the gender pay gap, and that's something that actually shareholders are talking about these days. Women earned 72 cents for every dollar that men earned in 1990, and that figure, unfortunately, has not climbed very much, and you talk about that in the book. What's your, why? What's going on here? There's some talk that, women just are not as good as asking for more money as men. I always find that a pretty, that seems like a very condescending and general remark. But what do you see going on?
Well, but the evidence is that historically has been true. And though some of the more recent surveys, including one the Wall Street Journal commissioned last year, suggest that women are increasingly negotiating on their own behalves for pay and other things, nevertheless, the perception persists that there's something wrong with women who are asking for a raise. And the survey, which was done by McKinsey and leanin.org, covering 70,000 men and women, found that women still are perceived as bossy and more aggressive in looking for a raise than men are who do so. And that same survey also found out that men are more likely to get a raise without even asking for it. And so the theme of my chapter in the book about the gender pay gap is if you don't ask, you don't get. But you have to be able to ask from a position of knowledge. You have to go into negotiations knowing what it is, not only that you expect to be paid, but what someone who's already in that job was making, or people in comparable jobs are making, either at that company or elsewhere. And so to the extent that women are seen as valuable and are bringing value to the workplace, and they go into negotiations knowing what they're worth, it increases their leverage.
Sure. And now there are more sources, publicly available sources for that kind of knowledge. You devote an entire chapter to sexual harassment, and this is well before the recent Me Too movement. Of course, obviously, sexual harassment is not a new issue in any walk of life. But now we're seeing it really take hold, and executives being tossed out. Are you surprised at the momentum we're seeing today, and why now?
Well, I think it's because so many people have read my book.
That's a contributing factor, no doubt.
No, but more seriously, what's very disturbing about the chapter in the book is how few of these women felt when they were subject to sexual harassment in their 20s and 30s that they could do anything about it without completely jeopardizing their careers. And I recently wrote a Your Executive Career column, only appeared a few weeks ago, on this very topic as to what are the career consequences for executive women who choose to speak out of being sexually harassed, and to what extent can they conceal this if there is a non-disclosure agreement, and what are the chances of the former employer and the former harasser abiding by their side of the story. And of course, to the extent that you sign that non-disclosure agreement, no one ever can find out what exactly happened to you. And so I think what has spurred the Me Too movement and all these toppling of powerful men has been my profession, has been brave and determined journalists who not only exposed Harvey Weinstein and countless other scandals, but did so by not just taking the victim's word for it, which has frankly been the reason these harassers have gotten away with the bad conduct that they have. They've gone out and they've found not one, not two, but in many cases dozens of others to corroborate the story and to make clear that the woman who got harassed told these loved ones or friends or colleagues when it happened, and nothing came of it. My own newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, where I've worked for decades, broke the story about the CEO of Wynn Resorts, Steve Wynn, and had another blockbuster piece on this very topic last week. The interesting thing, though, about the Me Too movement, it has now spawned another offshoot that I was just reading about today in the UK called the Pay Me Too movement, in which lawmakers in the UK are asking women to come forward with their stories about how they were paid unfairly and solutions that they've come up with to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, that's encouraging. I mean, my sense is that social media also is at play here in terms of this kind of, things going viral, exploding, getting a lot of momentum. Something kind of goes along with this, especially the asking for more money. You spent an entire chapter talking about executive presence. And to me, telling a woman that she lacks executive presence, which I have heard of people talking about in their performance reviews, sounds like me, a polite way of, you're not getting this job because you're a woman. I mean, to me, it's pretty clear.
Have you ever told a woman that?
Well, I've told people that I mentor that when people say you lack executive presence, I think there's some sexism going on there.
Have you ever told a man that?
Yes, but not their direct superior because it was complicated at the time. But I'm surprised that I still hear this. Unfortunately, I don't have the solutions in terms of how what advice to give. But what did you learn about this subject from the women you interviewed, and for sure had to deal with this?
Well, it's interesting. When I wrote Your Executive Career column on the fact that some companies were offering women training in executive presence, it got a huge response. And in fact, it stayed on our website for like 3 years because I had before and after pictures of one young woman who, when she gets promoted to middle manager, kind of still looks like the software engineer or whatever her profession had been before that. And then she goes to this workshop that her employer had hosted, where a woman who is an executive coach and teaches women about the importance of executive presence essentially offers to do a makeover on not only how she carries herself in meetings, but how she does her hair, how she dresses. And so we ran this before and after picture. And the before picture, she looked like a perfectly well-dressed professional. And in the after picture, she looked like the middle manager she had become. And so it is sexist in the sense that we treat our female leaders differently than we treat male leaders. And we expect men to look the part, to act the part, because our stereotype of leadership is a man. Even when women are asked, to look at resumes and they have the exact same qualifications and they put a woman's name on top versus a man's name, they'll usually hire the man, not the woman. And it all goes back to unconscious bias. And so the way you deal with unconscious bias is you look the part, you act the part, and you know the part. And I thought there was this great quote at the end of that chapter, because every chapter has little leadership tips, from Denise Morrison, the Campbell Soup CEO. And she talked about the fact when you go in a grocery store, do you buy the package of cookies that's beaten up and looks like it's been thrown on the floor? Or do you buy the package of cookies that's new and shiny? And so she says, men and women alike, people are going to respond to your packaging. And I think that's true, but more so for women, simply because of the status of women in leadership.
Yeah, I mean, it's frustrating in terms of, talking about executive presence and how you overcome that and asking for more money. There's a lot of, the onus is on the woman to really kind of, step up their game. And the men seem to be, let off the hook, or at least, they're giving some training on unconscious bias and that kind of stuff, micro inequities, but,
Which I think is a
know,
good step in the
yeah,
right direction.
yeah,
And one of the things I've been impressed about in going around the country talking about the book is not only are there more companies where this is mandatory, but there are some college campuses where they're instituting it, even at the undergraduate or business school level. It's never too soon to open up everyone's eyes, men and women alike, as to the fact that we do have unconscious biases, and we have to put in structures that enable us to get around them, whether it's blind resumes or multi-gendered, multi-ethnic group panels of interviewers. There are lots of ways that we can sort of anticipate and get around our unconscious biases.
So, that brings us to another subject or similar subject in terms of, you yourself have had to overcome a lot of challenges in your career related to gender and other kind of related subjects. So were you writing or you interviewing people for the book and then writing it, were you saying, wow, these are the same exact things that I had to deal with and we haven't changed at all, or wow, we've actually come quite a long way?
Both.
Both. Okay.
But I frankly think I was quite surprised at how extensive the mistreatment was for many of these women early in their careers and later in their careers, too. I think the story that probably shocked me the most was the one that Carol Baritz told, who becomes CEO for the first time at Autodesk, later becomes CEO of Yahoo, and is diagnosed with breast cancer about a month after her debut as CEO. She feels, as the CEO of a publicly held company, she owes it to her shareholders to let them know what's going on. So at her very first news conference, at a tech industry conference, she announces that she's going to be entering the hospital the next day for surgery related to her breast cancer. And there's only one question raised by one journalist. It's a young man in the back of the room. And he raises his hand, and I often ask people at my events, what do you think his question is? And most people say, well, who's going to be the acting CEO, or what is the contingency plan if, God forbid, you are too ill to return to work? All of which would be legitimate news conference questions from a brand new CEO of a public company. His question was, which breast? Okay. Now, I'm also very cheered by how far women have come. There are still relatively few women in the CEO spot, and even more depressing, there are relatively few women who, when they step down from CEO, are replaced by a CEO.
Sure.
But the next level below that, the top executives who are reporting to the CEO, that percentage is starting to get to be meaningful.
Yeah. So the pipeline is being filled, which is what
but
a lot
not
of people.
Very quickly.
Not as quickly as we need it to be. So I actually get numerous calls from women who are retired or sitting executives looking for guidance on how to land board seats. So, transitioning into corporate governance. You recently published a piece in the journal called "Why Breaking into the Boardroom is Harder for Women." This was just a month or two ago, and that the subline was "Businesses prefer veteran female directors over untested one. Research shows." So, maybe talk a little bit about what you learned and what's in the story about how women get their first board seat, or their common threads in terms of,
Sure.
How you get traction.
Well, for that particular story, I was drawing a contrast between women who get asked time and time again to go on another board, but who are already on more boards than they can possibly handle. But they're a proven commodity. And it gets back to the same issue of how we perceive women as leaders. Is how do we perceive women as board members? Boards want comfort with the notion of someone having had prior board experience. And they need that to a greater degree with a female director than they do with men, because the guys are people who look just like us. More importantly, the man who maybe has never been on a corporate board before is probably going to be better networked and has more people speaking on his behalf who are either already on the board or who are doing the search. And I think the biggest takeaway that I found from reporting that story, because I was comparing that with women who had fantastic backgrounds but had tremendous trouble getting their first board seat, is that when the woman has as her advocate, particularly not a recruiter, but a former boss, and especially someone who is her CEO that she reported to, acting as the door opener, the sky's the limit, as we like to say, because that person has the credibility and the veritas that will then allow somebody to consider them. There are also now a couple search firms, one in particular, that for money will go and find a first board seat for a high potential executive woman. And part of that process, and it's a long process, generally it's taking 18 months to 2 years, involves teaching this woman how to prepare for board interviews, which are different than job interviews, how to put together a board biography, and then lots of networking meetings with chairs of nominating governance committees. There's also been research that has shown that the boards that have more women often have women as chairs of the nominating governance committee or a woman as CEO. Not a big shock there either, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's all, unfortunately not surprising, but, I find it amazing that people just are more comfortable with a complete rookie director who's a man versus who's a woman.
We're all like that. We're all comfortable with what we know, who we know, or somebody who looks just like you, of course. I mean, that's human nature. But we have to sort of see beyond that. And again, just like in answer to your earlier question, good news, bad news, I'm also encouraged by the fact that this issue of gender representation in the boardroom changing is one that has caught fire now with mainstream investors, the State Street and the BlackRocks of the world, as well as several big public pension funds. I just broke a story recently about this campaign that the state of New York has launched to say, if you have 0 women on the board, we're not just going to oppose the reelection of the nominating and governance committee chair or members. We're going to oppose the reelection of every director standing for reelection. And I subsequently found out there were some smaller public pension funds that have done that even if there's only a minority of women on the board. And I think that is giving some momentum. It's a little snowball that's going to become a big snow boulder. Because I think at the end of the day, directors don't really care that much about shareholder resolutions passing or failing. But they do care, even if they still get renominated, about getting a very bad reelection vote or even getting defeated.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I've noticed the same thing in terms of the shareholder proposal is fairly, it's not personalized, whereas director election vote, if you get a relatively low score, it affects your personal reputation, and that's what these people care most about.
One would hope it would affect your personal reputation. But boards also need to change their rules about majority voting. Sure. Because this idea that you can fail to get majority of the votes cast, and then we'll decide in our wisdom whether you're not good enough to stay on the board, it's ridiculous. What is the point then of having these votes if you're not going to honor the shareholders' wishes?
Yeah.
Aren't the board members supposed to be representing their shareholders?
Well, that's a whole nother webcast. Let's see. And so, you talk about how women in position of power can do a lot to help other women and advance their careers. So in terms of, helping women get board seats, what have you seen, on that front?
Well, I saw this in reporting the book, and it's also in writing a number of stories about the issues of gender diversity in boardrooms. And when there's only one woman on the board, she tends to keep her mouth shut. She tends to wait a while before she tries to make an impact on the board deliberations. And she also tends to not be hugely outspoken, at least at the outset, about the need for greater gender diversity. But once there gets to be 2 or 3, there is solidarity in numbers, and they tend to be more outspoken and much better advocates for even further gender diversity on the board. And it all comes down to who can you talk to when you go on the bathroom breaks. Mm-hmm. And the story I wrote about what happens to the gender makeup of boards where the CEO is a woman had this wonderful lead anecdote about Avon, where a majority of the board members at that point were women, as well as the CEO, and about the fact that the men had to walk further down the hall to get to the men's room than the women did. I've also talked to women, particularly on management teams where they were the only woman, where during a break in a very tense negotiation, the guys all went to the men's room and finished the discussion, and she had to go to the ladies' room, obviously by herself, and then they came back with it as a fait accompli.
Yeah, I mean, these are stories that you kind of hear about as, oh, there must be an urban myth, but
oh no, but
this happens.
There's another variation on that story. After I told that, or a woman I was on a panel with who had been in my book told that story. So this woman comes up to me afterwards and she said, well, a friend of mine was a partner at a law firm and on the managing committee, the only woman. And the first time this happened, the guys go to the men's room, make a decision, and come back. She's really annoyed. The second time they have a break, she follows them into the men's room. And they say, what are you doing here? And she says, until you stop making your decisions in the men's room, I'm following you. And guess what? They didn't make any more decisions in the men's room.
Well, good.
But I also want to make the point that a number of the women that I talked to who became corporate directors in addition to their successful management careers then became very cognizant of this idea of trying to help other women. Because like the women in my story, they were constantly being asked to take on more board seats than they could. And so Kathleen Lagaki, for instance, would keep a little Rolodex list of women that she knew were board ready and who were different backgrounds, but who she could personally vouch for. So that when she would get called, she would say, I have 5 women who are just as qualified as I am. Let me tell you about them.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Do we have questions coming in yet?
Let's see. Oh, we do. Sorry. What do you think is more important, more female CEOs or more female board directors, and why?
I think both are important, but at the end of the day, what I think is more important is having more female directors. Frankly, because CEO positions, well, board positions don't change that often either, but CEOs don't change hopefully more than every 10 years or so. Plus, there are many more board members than there are CEO positions. And so I think in order to change the practices of corporate America, we have to change the face of corporate boardrooms.
I actually would have had the opposite answer. I think, a CEO, as we know, CEOs have a lot of power in terms of who they choose on their
many
board.
Fewer of them around.
True. But,
so if you're trying to have a broader impact,
yeah.
Let's populate the boardroom.
True.
Obviously, we need to have more female CEOs too, but the questioner wanted me to choose between one of the two.
Yeah. Okay, well, you took one, I took the other.
That's fine, right?
Another question, this person said this is a difficult question. Actually, no, someone has answered the question saying both more board directors will have more influence on the direction of the company. So someone subscribing to your theory,
there you
so
go.
we'll defer to that. You talk about women coming into the boardroom. They're the first woman, and this need to gain acceptance from the male board members. We did a survey about board chairs of boards that don't have any women and kind of what's stopping you. And one of the comments was, well, having a woman in the boardroom, that would just change the whole dynamic of the place. It's like, well, yeah, isn't that the whole point? But so, obviously
we wouldn't be able to use 4-letter words, they would say.
Exactly,
probably,
exactly. Right? So other than kind of, using foul language, how is a woman, supposed to gain acceptance from the fellow board members based on, your experience and research?
Well, another story that I recently did for the Wall Street Journal was about the fact that a number of boards are now creating formal mentorship programs in which a more experienced board member is assigned to the newest board member. And so the lead example involved Carol Bards mentoring a female director who had just joined a board where she's the lead director, where this woman had terrific, experience in terms of what the board needed from a professional standpoint, but had never been on a public company board before. And so Carol was able to not only tell her about the interpersonal dynamics as well as kind of the unspoken rules of how that board operated, but she was able to coach her and urge her to not sit on her hands for the first 9 or 12 months getting the lay of the land, but instead to speak up early, speak up often, and not be afraid to challenge others, but nevertheless to understand what was the backstory for some of the issues, and to give her feedback after her first couple of board meetings to say, you did this well, you could have done that better or whatever. And these mentees, whether it is a woman or a guy who's new to that industry, really appreciate that kind of feedback and help. I also have found that in reporting the book that several of these executive women who go on to become corporate directors then see as part of their responsibility as fostering the advancement of women in that company and making sure that high potential women get the right range of experiences that make them well-rounded enough that they could be candidates for the number 2 or number 1 job. But equally important, there are instances cited in the book where when these women are serving as corporate directors, they also go out of their ways to make sure the gender pay gap is closed. And that's not always easy for a CEO to do. You're trying to bring a high potential woman into a senior level role to put her on par with these men who are direct reports to the CEO. But there's such a pay gap that it would be outlandish to give her, say, a $200,000 raise to bring her up to an even level with the male peers. So the CEO, in at least one is cited in the book, increases her pay by $100,000. And this board member, who is a former CEO herself and is on the comp committee, gets support from her fellow comp committee members, doesn't act as one voice in the wilderness, to say she's still underpaid compared to her peers. And not only that, based on their performance reviews, she is outperforming her male peers. And the CEO's response is, we can't make that leap immediately. And so the comp committee's response was, fine, how soon? And she was brought up to parity within a year. The other thing that's interesting is this woman who was affected by this never understood or knew about the behind-the-scenes role that this female director was playing. And I went back and I looked more than a year after the book came out to find out how many of these 52 women are actually serving as corporate directors, and I discovered that more than 2/3 are on boards, and these are major companies, the biggest companies in America. So these women have earned it in their corporate lives, and now they're continuing to earn it and give back and return it in their roles as corporate directors. And to me, that's great.
Yeah,
that's the way it should be.
Exactly, and in the history of the United States, we've seen that in many different contexts. Let's see. We have another question coming in. Unless you are a director or an executive of a large company, board seats are difficult to attain. What about smaller companies that can use the direction and support of women from mid-level business careers?
Well, I think the trick here is to get your first public company board experience. And there are several routes to do that if you don't already have someone serving as your advocate, like the CEO that you're reporting to. One way is to get nonprofit experience on a major nationally known nonprofit, which, depending on what the nonprofit does, can or cannot be a stepping stone to getting on a public company board. But another way is to work with an executive search firm, and you should deal with multiple executive recruiters, and try and find a way to get on a board of a smaller public company than the company where you now work. Because especially if you've got the expertise that everybody is dying to get, whether it's digital or or cybersecurity, a smaller public company board is going to value your professional expertise as well as your knowledge about how business is done in a larger corporate setting. And in those cases, may be willing to take someone who is not a direct report to the CEO because of the two things. Expertise in an area where we have no expertise or little expertise, and knowledge about how things work in a bigger enterprise.
Yeah, I think,
And that's true for men too.
Sure. Yeah, in terms of, like you were talking about being board ready in terms of learning how to do a board interview, put together a board resume, tell people, look, learn what the hot topics are in corporate governance. And if you have, cybersecurity expertise, then, puff that up a bit on your resume.
And that's why you are seeing in some major corporate boardrooms, women at lower levels than we've seen in the past getting on boards because they have a particular hot expertise. Unfortunately, like everything else, fashions come in and out of popularity, and so next year cybersecurity may not be the hot.
So got to stay on top of it.
You do.
Let's see. Another question. What is your view on the board gender quotas that exist in France, Germany, etc.?
Well, there are a number of countries in Europe, Norway was the first, that have legislated how many and what percentage of boards have to be female. I actually went over to Norway the month before that law took effect, and the law said that 40% of public company boards had to be female, or else the company would be dissolved.
Yeah, within a very short period of time.
Yeah. And I was there in December, and it was taking effect at the end of January. What I was really surprised by in the women I met in reporting that story was how there was a very small nucleus who were getting all the board seats offered, just like I pointed out in that recent journal.
The usual suspect effect.
Yeah. I mean, they were either proven entrepreneurs, or they had run their own small company, or they had been in a fairly large company in a pretty senior role, but they were getting 50, 60 board offers. And then Norway's example was followed by, as the questioner pointed out, similar quotas in other countries. And those quotas have had a profound impact at speeding up the representation of women on boards in those countries. Although when I was in Norway, I was surprised that they weren't looking for women outside of Norway, but they said you had to be able to speak Norwegian. So I don't think our business culture or our political culture would support a legislated quota in this country. And so, unfortunately, we're stuck with the private sector for the time being and for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I mean, the discussions I've had about this always come back to, well, this is great outside the U.S., but it would never work, or it would never be acceptable in the U.S. But in terms of progress, we don't see much progress. We see less than, about 20% of board seats held by women. Companies. And the replacement rate is only 30%. So, it's gonna take a while. And you've like you've said that, it's really relying on the private sector, and, you've talked about in your book how this, these coalitions, the 30-30 coalition, the 20-20 coalition, 30% club, it's almost like a mini industry out there.
But the 2020 coalition is actually, at least for the biggest companies, achieved its initial goal ahead of 2020.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
That is progress.
So, any thoughts about getting more traction on this? Beyond just kind of this, there's the carrot and the stick approach that seem to be used in the United States, and I'm not sure, much else can be done.
Well, I think what has to happen is some of these institutional investors have to be forming broader institutional investor coalitions around the issue. There seems to be a lot of reinventing of the wheel. State Street goes off and does its thing. BlackRock goes off and does its thing. The state of New York does its thing. Apparently, other states' pension funds are doing their thing. And while there have been some efforts at doing letter writing campaigns that have been coordinated, I don't think there's been any kind of coordinated campaign of opposing an entire board around this issue. And I did ask the state of New York when I broke that story, why aren't you getting other public pension funds to sign on to your campaign? And their response was, well, we expect others will follow suit when they see what we're doing. So I think that's one direction. I think the other direction is that boards, to their credit, are getting the message about the importance of refreshment, which is the code word for let's get rid of some of the male, pale, and stale board members and bring in people who don't look like the male, pale, and stale board members. And that does mean, however, that boards actually have to obey their own rules. You can't have mandatory retirement ages and waive them just because Joe doesn't feel like galloping off into the sunset.
Or voting to raise it from 72 to 75.
Again, an issue I have written about as well for the journal. And by the same token, I'm always surprised at how few companies in this country have term limits.
Yes. Yeah.
But that too is starting to change, as we've just seen happen at General Electric, which has done a huge shakeup of not only the size, but the makeup of their board under the direction of their new CEO. But before he became CEO, the board had already approved a term limit policy, grandfathered in, albeit I think that's fair. But nevertheless, the way big companies act, they tend to be pace setters. Mid-sized and smaller companies tend to follow suit. I don't see any kind of tsunami of term limits happening, but there isn't going to be major significant improvement in the representation of women on boards until boards enforce their mandatory retirement ages and, even more importantly, put in term limits.
Yeah. Now you have to free up seats, and there are only so many ways to do that.
There's little turnover in boards, as the Spencer Stewart Annual Director Survey shows time after time.
Yeah, and it's amazing, a lot of companies, they don't have either. They don't have a tenure limit or any kind of mandatory retirement age, which makes it very difficult.
But back to the comment that you heard when you did the survey of board chair where they had no women, and the chairs would say, well, that would change the dynamic. Another story that you'll read about in the book is what happened at KeyCorp when they were deciding who would be the next CEO, and there was a man and a woman internal candidate. The board had a significant number of women at that point, but among the independent directors who were going to make the decision, the representation of women was even higher. And so in reporting the book, I talked to one of those female directors. What difference did it make that there was significant representation of women among the independent directors who were choosing between Beth Mooney and a male executive? She said the most important impact that having that many women had on that process is it took gender as an issue off the table.
Really?
And instead we were choosing between two highly qualified candidates. And no one ever then brought up the question of, well, how's it going to look to our shareholders and our customers to have a woman as CEO, because we've never had a woman CEO before. And when she gets promoted to CEO in 2011, she becomes the first female CEO of a major financial services institution in America. 7 years later, here we are. She is still the only woman CEO of a major financial institution in this country.
Showing that, having more women on boards can lead to more CEOs, as we were talking
in
before.
Some cases.
Yes.
In some cases.
Well, that's a great, great story. Hopefully we'll be hearing more about that. Let's see. I just want to, I think, to wrap up, just, people, in case people don't know, you have recently announced your retirement later this month. So congratulations. I'm sure there's, mixed emotions around
Absolutely.
that. But you've had a fantastic and storied career. There's a really great video of your kind of, what do you say, your career summed up in
90 seconds.
90 seconds. And where can people find that?
They can find it on YouTube just by clicking on journalist.wsj.com.
Got it. So
it's called the Face of Real News campaign.
Got it. And so, any plans for immediate post-retirement?
Well, I hope to be doing more events talking about the book and about the women who shared their stories and are returning it and not just earning it. I would like to come up with an idea for another book, TBD, and I hope to also be doing some freelancing for the Wall Street Journal.
Great, great. Well, we can always use, more investigative long-form reporting, which I hope you'll, fill that what seems to be a void these days. Um, but so anyway, in closing, I want to thank you very much for coming on and sharing so much about yourself and the knowledge you've gained over the years, and what's in the book. And I know a lot of viewers will be going out to purchase a copy and read it. Um, so let's see. If we don't have any more questions, just want to wrap up. We will have another episode of Governance Watch coming up on May 8th at noon, and we'll be talking about private investments in public equity, also known as PIPEs, and that's with our partner, the law firm Cleary Gottlieb, Steen and Hamilton. We'll have another webcast on May 21st about the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and we'll hear from people who are directly involved in that. And we'll also have a book discussion webcast later in June with a guy named Adam Epstein. His book, The Perfect Corporate Board, A Handbook for Mastering the Unique Challenges of Small Cap Companies. So that will be, that will kind of cover a need of talking about small and mid cap companies, since we focus so much on the mega caps here. Let's see, we've got the conference board has the 14th annual Women's Leadership Conference coming up on May 1st and 2nd. Some great topics, great speakers, so I encourage you to take a look at that. Again, those interested in CPE credits, please ensure that you're entered your full name and email address and specified CPE in the space provided at the bottom of your screen. Hopefully you were watching the whole time and you clicked OK the 3 times those boxes popped up. Again, thanks, Joanne, and everybody. Look for the replay of this webcast to be posted fairly soon, and share it with your colleagues. And thank you for participating, and we will see you next time.